Why vaccine efficacy is declining and the implications of a third dose. The statement the immune system is incredibly complex is a woefully minimal description of the intricate set of interconnected reactions, collectively called the immune system that protects us from disease causing agents. Recent data suggest that the effectiveness of COVID 19 vaccines has been declining. This article explores the possible reasons and the implications of a third dose. The table alongside shows some summary findings from Israel, UK, and the US for vaccine effectiveness in preventing COVID infections. The data indicates that while the protection against the infection as shown by effectiveness against symptomatic COVID has declined, especially in Israel and USA, the protection against hospitalization on COVID remains high. The Israel study also showed that individuals vaccinated in early 2021 are more susceptible to infection as compared to people vaccinated later. Is this a cause for alarm? No, because protection against hospitalization is still high. Ideally, a public vaccination program should protect the population from infection, transmission, and hospitalization. Initially, vaccine efficacy data showed high efficacy versus infection and hospitalization. Even if protection against infection decreases, vaccines highly protective against hospitalization are still beneficial because hospitalization places the maximum burden on healthcare capacity. As long as the disease can be managed at home, then is it any worse than flu-like discomfort? The data do show the protection versus hospitalizations remains high. The recent disease trends in the UK provide additional support. Recently, cases there reached up to 85% of the prior peak in January 2021, whereas the number of deaths stayed at 10% of the prior peak. Any concerns about the number being in the 70s and 80s versus the health initial high 90s are countered by two observations. One is that the initial efficacy numbers were based on few months' data from trials in a highly controlled setting. Real world data tend to be lower. Furthermore, there are confidence intervals around these averages that make any concrete conclusion about a true decline in effectiveness difficult. What could be the explanation for the differences in effectiveness? The statement the immune system is incredibly complex is a woefully minimal description of the intricate set of interconnected reactions collectively called the immune system that protects us from disease causing agents. The explanation below is basic outline, and as with any simplification some inaccuracies creep in, but these do not distort the overall message. The virus, as it infects the body, is primarily found in two locations. One is the circulation system that it uses to travel around the body. The second is the cells of various tissues that the virus invades and uses to multiply. Logically, therefore, the immune system has two main arms to confront the virus in these two locations. One is the antibody arm. Antibodies lock in on certain surface proteins of the circulating viruses, thereby preventing it from invading our cells. Further, they tag the virus for destruction. Thus, antibodies can be thought of as a first line of defense, but they become ineffective once the virus enters the cell. At this point, the second arm of the immune response becomes relevant. This arm is aptly called killer T cell arm. These cells target our own body cells that harbor the virus and within which the virus replicates. The T cells kill such cells, thereby eliminating the virus within them, proceeding with simplistic view that disease is caused once the virus takes hold in our body cells. A strong T cell immune function can protect from severe disease even if the antibody response is weak. Vaccination establishes the two arms of the immune response. These two arms can be matured differently with time and in response to variants. Circulating antibody levels decline with time. Even though there is memory in the system to produce antibodies on demand, Jumpstarting this memory at a subsequent encounter can take time. A weak and delayed antibody response would result in an infection, but if the T cell response is intact, the individual would be protected from severe disease. Additionally, vaccine effectiveness can reduce because the immune system that has been primed by one variant has to counter a new variant. Even here, the difference in response of the two arms to a variant are crucial. The antibody arm reacts to the viral surface proteins, primarily the shape or the 3D configuration, and thus change in the surface protein can reduce the effectiveness of the antibody response. The T cells, however, react to smaller fragments of the surface and other viral proteins. Since the T cells respond to a broader set of targets, more proteins as compared to antibodies that respond to a specific site or sites on the surface protein controlled by the local shape at the site, the T cell response can be more resistant to virus. So the table can be explained by a decline in antibody effectiveness caused by time and variants that reduces VE versus symptomatic diseases. Continuing effectiveness of the T cell response explains the ongoing protection against hospitalization. An important note is that at present this explanation is conjecture based on the general principle of immune system function. Recent studies tracking a few individuals have reported that T cells response to COVID vaccine is durable and effective versus the variants. More data will be required to confirm and perfect the above basic explanation. The simplified picture also indicates that circulating antibodies are not the entirety of the available protective resources. Antibody tests are easier to implement at large scale as compared to T cells measurement and are therefore widely available. Individuals, however, should not base lifestyle decisions on such tests. The best practice is to get vaccinated and follow the local guidance on appropriate behavior. Will a third dose help? Given that a 2 days regimen is still high protective against hospitalization, the principal benefit of a third dose would be in improving the effectiveness versus infection. Current limited data shows improvement in antibody level and increase in effectiveness after the third dose. Consequently, some countries are considering a targeted rollout of the third dose in high-risk population. Nevertheless, there are other questions to consider. Since the vaccine is still based on the original Wuhan strain, the longer term effectiveness is one concern. If immunity wanes after 2 doses, how long will the third dose remain effective? Will it protect against potential new variants? Another vital topic, especially in a resource constant situation, is the balance between reducing infection in an already vaccinated population by a third dose weighted against denying a first or second dose, one that protects from hospitalization to the partially or completely unvaccinated. An imperfect analogy is the choice between giving a life jacket to an individual already wearing one versus to a person without one. The analogy also highlights the conflicting interest of the individual versus the collective. In India, the majority of the population is not fully vaccinated and is therefore susceptible to hospitalization. Furthermore, there is no data in the Indian population assessing possible reduction in 2 days effectiveness and benefits of a third. With such lingering questions and continued vaccine supply constraints, the priority should remain full vaccination of the eligible population to control hospitalization. The basic precautions to control the spread, such as masking, distancing, basic hygiene, and ensuring appropriate ventilation in crowded indoor spaces, should continue. Thank you.